a slightly different style video for me because I like to talk to you today in slightly more detail about apprenticeships, and which is a sector that I'm involved with, a sector that I've been supporting for many years now. And we're in sort of July 2018, which is more or less at the academic year of the end of the academic year 2017-18, and it's the first full year for the Apprenticeship Levy and its implementation since its introduction last year. It's been a year where there's been a lot of talk about apprenticeships, not just in the specialist press and media, but also in mainstream press as well. Predominantly reporting on some negativity, the lack of numbers, lack of starts, the fact that the apprenticeship levy is failing, there's been a significant decrease in apprenticeships or in total, those sort of things, and particularly in terms of comparisons with sort of targets from before and also comparisons where the government set targets. Before I go further, I have previously spoken about this and I've stated that apprenticeships, there's new starts, there's also existing employees that are converted onto an apprenticeship or put onto an apprenticeship program. In terms of new starts, there's been a growth. And there's been a growth in terms of new employment that's been created as a result of an apprenticeship program. In terms of existing employees, that's where the decrease has been. So there's less people who've signed on to an apprenticeship program while they're employed. And there's a number of reasons for that. I have discussed it before, but there's a number of reasons. Partly there's been some ESF funding, there's been also advanced learning loans. Obviously, there's been the contribution that employers have had to pay. In addition to that, there's also been constraints like the 20% off the job rule and various other things as well. So there's a number of reasons. The DFE publishes year-on-year figures, and they've got their targets and they've got their numbers that they're trying to hit. The public sector has specific targets that they've been given. 2.3% is the public sector target for their workforce. So 2.3% of the workforce for various public sector organisations to have as apprentices. That could be existing people, that could be new starts. And the stats are saying that most public sector bodies, most public sector organisations have actually hit the targets, they've smashed the targets, and on average it's like 2.9%, circa 2.9%. That seems to be the figure. If I go back to the reason why the apprenticeship levy was implemented, the reason why it's all started, and that's really as a position for bringing new money into the sector. And if you talk about new money, there's an expectation that around £2.5 billion of new funds are going to come in, which is going to be used for training. And the OBR, which is the government body for Office of Budget Responsibility, they're basically stating that it might be slightly low. It could be a 0.9 below the 0.9 billion, which is 900 million below those sort of numbers, but it's significant in terms of new cash that's coming into the sector. So over a 4-year period, it's likely to be £10 billion of new funds that are coming in. So a huge amount of new funds that are coming into the sector. There's also talk about lack of organisations that the money has gone in, but organisations are sitting on it. They're not actually spending it, and that figure seems to be coming in around only 10% has been used. So therefore, 90% of monies hasn't been used to where it is meant to be. And in that respect, there's talks about giving organisations some grace, extending periods where they can spend the money, There's also some additional flexibilities that have been introduced, such as transferring, and we'll talk a little bit more about transferring and those sort of things as well. But also at the same time, certain organisations are just getting up to the speed with regard to what they've got to do. There's procurement processes taking place, so these things take time. So obviously, what you'll find is that there is going to be flexibility. There is going to be that money that's going to be spent. But at the moment, the common thread is that very small amount of that money is actually going into sort of skills development and apprenticeships. But what you'll find is that there's going to be more and more employers who are going to be in scope for apprenticeship activity. And you start off with next year, which is going to be the first sort of change where the smaller employers, the SME employers, who are presently not paying into the levy, they're going to be given access to a digital service, a digital account, where they're going to be controlling funds in terms of making choices, in terms of who they're going to work with. So what you're going to find is, for the first time ever, funds are not going to come from government directly to providers. They're going to go via employers. So that's going to be April 2019, which is a significant change really for the skill sector. So talking about direction and control, the employers being in the driving seat, definitely in the driving seat if they're controlling all the funds and controlling who they're going to be working with and those sort of things. So that's potentially worrying, in one respect, but also a fantastic opportunity. Nevertheless, it's a fantastic opportunity for employers, and again, a fantastic opportunity with regard to generally the sector as a whole. I briefly touched on the fact that 10% can be transferred to other employers for them to utilise the levy. So large employers, where they're not utilising the levy or the levy funds, can now transfer 10% of their account to others. What the theme is that large employers will use that to support their supply chain. Some of them may pass funds on to others as part of corporate social responsibility, CSR, and there's conversations in terms of, obviously there's certain restrictions there, restrictions in terms of it's perceived as government funding, the restrictions in terms of they can only do that with one employer, but no doubt there's going to be more and more flexibilities there. So that's something that's interesting, something that we'll hear more of. In terms of an obstacle for the growth, in terms of apprenticeship numbers, I think one of the biggest sort of obstacle is the 20% off the job training. There's been some clarification on this recently, which is not great news, but it's nevertheless it's still a clarification. And that clarification, as far as my understanding is concerned, is that 20% firstly is the minimum. Secondly, that 20% needs to be structured. It can't be just 20% of the job training that doesn't really map to anything. So it needs to be mapped to standards. It needs to be done with consideration and planning. And anything that's not mapped or can't be mapped won't count. So that's a big constraint, big restriction there. Another thing that sort of affected the figures in terms of the growth is subcontracting and the use of subcontractors. So the first change that's happened is from January this year, there's been a restriction in terms of how you subcontract, and more talk has been on subcontracting, and that's been from the basis of creating value for money, and initially from the viewpoint that if there is any subcontracting, generally it's inefficient and it's ineffective. It's not great value for money. So from January 2018, there has been guidance to say that subcontracting can take place, but only if the lead provider has delivered some substance in themselves, and that word substance is very similar to the word that's used within the legal professional, which is reasonable. So it's very similar in that respect, and the government has actually stated they're not going to give further clarification on that word of what that means. But again, it's about direction and control. It's about who's got control and who's leading the sort of relationship with the employer, and who's in the driving seat. And again, I believe personally there needs to be more sort of clarification on this. There needs to be more support for subcontracting, and the Association of Employment Learning Providers (ALP) is again probably leading on this and driving through some of the positivities and the change that's happening. Something else that I want to talk about very briefly, which is again with regard to employers delivering on the apprenticeship, and the guidance has been, particularly where the employer is a subcontractor or a delivery partner to the prime contractor, they can't work with that prime for or with a margin. There can't be an ROI apart from the ROI for doing the apprenticeship, so they can't be doing it for profit. So whatever the employer delivers themselves, it has to be at cost. So that's something again that's recently come out. So again, just in terms of apprenticeships as a whole, one of the biggest changes that I've seen recently is procurement, bidding and tendering. And if you look at bidding and tendering, the bids are getting much more complicated, and you've got employers saying that they really want to deal with more partnership bidding. And there's a word that's used often, which is managed service providers (MSP), where effectively you've got a lead and you've got the lead managing the relationship with others, and that sort of is coming out more and more. And potentially, as I said, bidding, tendering, procurement, it requires a lot of infrastructure, it requires a lot of cost base. It's a complicated process. It's expensive, and for all parties, for the employers, for the learning providers, and obviously for subcontractors. So potentially that's a good thing in that respect, in terms of there's more and more opportunities coming in for all parties as a result of that. I'm just going to go on to briefly talking about endpoint testing or endpoint assessments. And again, that's one of the biggest sort of conversations in this year about EPA and how EPAs are sort of managed, the relationship between EPA and a provider, the relationship between endpoint assessment organisation and the employer. And one of the main sort of guidance that's been given, and in reality it's different, is that the EPA needs to have a direct relationship with the employer, and the provider can't get involved in any shape or form. And in reality, the provider is sort of being guided by the employer is being guided by the provider, and the provider is a stakeholder and does have a say. And I think that doesn't that doesn't affect the work that the EPA needs to do, in terms of the fact that it needs to be rigorous, the endpoint testing needs to be robust, and it's fit for purpose. So I'm unsure in terms of the guidance that's coming out, the fact that it's nothing to do with the provider, and it's just a relationship directly with the employer. Again, that's something that is a little bit odd with the reality of it. GDPR has come in, which has affected every single organisation in the country. But in terms of apprenticeships, with the sort of arrangements that we have in terms of sharing information and so forth contractually, it's had an impact on all of us. And again, where most organisations are having to go through their contracts and going through the process in terms of ensuring the fact that we're compliant. Moving on, I want to talk a little bit about the mass influx of new providers who have come into the particular sector. There's been a dearth of new providers, and some of them have delivered apprenticeships previously, but a lot of them are commercial training organisations who've got no experience of funding and haven't delivered funding in any kind. And what I'm finding is that their methods haven't changed, their delivery hasn't changed, and they're doing what they've always done, and that's the danger. It's effectively a rebadging exercise, and I think from what I'm finding out is that they're missing out key components of what they need to be delivering, such as assessments, and usually they're not. From my understanding, they're not taking into account any of the funding rules, which is a huge risk. Okay. A lot of noise also about apprenticeship MBAs and organisations. Again, I would say it's a rebadging exercise. Organisations talking about apprenticeships. I think the sector's been talking about the fact that there's been a lot of management or high level apprenticeships, and you've got big sort of big brands really out there talking about apprenticeship MBAs and delivering MBAs, and there seems to be there seems to be a lot of chatter about this, and it's at odds with what ministers are talking about. So I'll be interested to know what's on the horizon there. Talking about the horizon and a little bit more horizon gazing, and some viewpoints that I'd like to share with you. I think the levy is here to stay. There's no doubt about that. It's just the funds are coming in. Yes, they may not be used, where the government wants the money to be used, but the funds are coming in. I think we'll get to where they want to get to, which is about 10 billion by 2020 within the 4 years. So that's a positive in one respect. Talked briefly about grace periods. Talked really about in terms of how they're going to utilize that. And I think transfers will pick up. There may be space for apprenticeship training agencies. There may be space for organisations to work in terms of how they can access and utilize this funding where the greatest need is. So we'll see a little bit about that. I think the combined authorities are eyeing definitely apprenticeship money, and they want to access those funds and be in a position where they have control. So that's interesting. Obviously, we're in Birmingham, so West Midlands Combined Authority have put out a few things in terms of apprenticeships and apprenticeship funding, and let's wait and see in terms of where that is. Public sector will continue to take a lead in terms of numbers. I think what you find is that there's more and more larger organisations who are going to be actively sort of utilising their funds, not just in terms of a way to look at their talent pool, but also in terms of PR and really growth and doing the right thing, which is still a positive thing. I think subcontracting will remain. I think it needs to remain, but it needs to be seen more in a positive light, and that's something that I strongly believe in. I think there needs to be more clarity in certain areas. I think something that the LPs, the Association of Employment Learning Providers, can sort of definitely lead on, and that's something we'll wait and see. What I'd like to see more is the sector all the SMEs taking more of a lead in terms of ambassadorial within the sector. and for SMEs to be embracing the opportunities there. I think the large employers are onto it, and the large employers have put the right infrastructure in place. Public sector, as I said, already has. SMEs, I think, a little bit slower in this, but I think potentially that's something that I like to see more of, for them to be championing this. The other thing I would say is that apprenticeships, again, in terms of what it is, it's just we talked about apprenticeships in terms of high level courses, but also apprenticeships in terms of younger people and putting employees on. It's just it's an area where the differentiation is just completely different, and what I would like to see is more recognition for apprenticeships that are newly created jobs, as opposed to apprenticeships that are with existing employees. And I personally think that the government needs to differentiate in terms of rate of pay, and also differentiate in terms of sort of targets and potentially bonuses with regard to providers that are working with and creating new jobs. Vacancy matching, those sort of things. A lot of costs that are incurred, and just to better clarify and better sort of I think differentiate and record those sort of figures. I think that's something that's needed. Unless you're actually looking into detail, it's the figures are not that easy to find out. Definitely more employers are going to come into scope, and whether that's through organically, the 3 million target stay, the 3 billion payroll target staying and employers naturally getting in, or the figure of 3 million coming down either by removal of the 15,000, which is currently in place, or the target, the payroll target coming down to 2 million, which is something that there's talks about. So there's quite a lot there, but definitely more employers are going to come into scope. I think we've covered quite a bit here. This is probably a longer video than I originally anticipated. It's a little bit longer than my other videos. But I just wanted to do a slightly different video, talk about and recognise the fact that we're coming to the end of a full academic year. The apprenticeship sector is there's been a lot of changes to the skill sector. I will do a video regarding general skill changes, because there's been quite a few developments there. But from my perspective, I think that's all for now. Hope it's been of some use to you. As always, any feedback, or if anybody wants to give me a shout out and have a conversation about any opportunities, I'm all for it. So thank you for your time. Thank you.